Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, one of the many dramatic events that occurred after the fall of France in 1940 was the attack by the Royal Navy on the French fleet in northwest Algeria, the subject of Bill Whiteside's book, Operation Catapult. He joins us now to talk about this event, both the actual military part of it, but particularly kind of the geopolitical situation and how it's been talked about in historiography over the years. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Bill. How are you today?
Wonderful, Paul. Thank you very much for having me here. Looking forward to speaking with you and your
audience. And we're going to get into it pretty straight away, and you're going to explain a little bit about who you are and how you came at this. And this is, I could have easily done I have an intro for the Churchill Reassessed series I do there, and Churchill's part of it, but in the end I went for my generic one. But Churchill obviously looms very large in this. And before we just get into the presentation, over 1,000 biographies of Churchill now, and yet still there's lots to talk about. Before we get into the presentation, do you find your own opinion of Churchill changes, or are you one of those, you have a strong opinion, had it for that way for a long time?
Oh no, it changes, and it evolved in 180, maybe eventually 360 degrees during the course of researching and writing this book. And I know the last thing the world needs is another book about Winston Churchill. So I'm very fortunate that I found this bit of micro history, this story. Yep. And it's funny, like people, neighbors, family members here, I'm working on a book about Winston Churchill, and they assume I am an expert now on Winston Churchill. I might be close to being an expert on 3 months out of the 90 years of his life. So I have that very intense focus. I mean, I admire him enormously, but my opinion on him in general and the wisdom of his decisions versus the French fleet seriously evolved the more I learned about this story.
Brilliant. Well, we'll bring up your slides. So, folks, there is going to be a lot of slides coming your way, a lot of information. You are, of course, welcome to field post questions, and I've got a couple that were sent in earlier, but basically we'll hand over to Bill to take us through this, and I'm looking forward to this. So over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks so much, Paul. I'm sure to just about everyone on this session, I'm an unknown. You've never heard of me before. My background before I got into writing about Winston Churchill and the war was I was a software salesman for 30 years. So that's certainly not going to impress you that I am the right person to write this history. So I thought it would be very important to share some background about how I got into this. That first book on the screen, The Last Line by William Manchester, is the book that really got me hooked on Winston Churchill. It was actually a gift from my late mother, and I read it and was just infatuated by his character, his personality, his sense of humor. And it was at a time before the war when Churchill was in the wilderness. He refers to them as his wilderness years. And a lot of people on this stream know that this was the second book of a planned trilogy. And unfortunately, William Manchester had a series of strokes after he finished this book. And he announced that there would not be a third book. And for the longest time, people interested in Churchill were just anguished that the trilogy would never be completed. And finally, in 2012, Paul Reed completed the trilogy. It's billed as being co-authored with Manchester, but Paul used a lot of some of Manchester's notes and completed the book. And that takes us from the war through the end of Winston Churchill's life. But the Manchester book ended pretty much when the serious fighting began in World War II, and it did not cover at all the events at Mers-el-Kébir, and I had no idea what had happened there. And then later on, I wanted to read a full biography, so I picked up Roy Jenkins' book, which is a massive book, 912 pages. 3 of those pages are dedicated to the story of Mers-el-Kébir, which is about right. That's appropriate perspective for a book of that size. And I can't remember if I literally did a double take, but I at least did a mental double take at some point after reading that the British had killed just under 1,300 French sailors and wounded another 350. And also there's this wonderful understatement. This engagement had a rankling effect on Franco-British relations for many years. But my instinct was that just could not have happened. Did I read something wrong? I went back and checked it. And then my initial thought was, did Roy Jenkins get something wrong? So I read more and more about this event. and I became very intrigued. And I mentioned I was a salesman at the time. I had a lot of free time on trains and planes and hotel rooms. So I started to research this story to keep my mind occupied. And one thing I want to cover here before I go any further, Jenkins mentioned the attack at Oran. And the actual attack happened in the harbor at Mers-el-Kébir. Oran is another port city about 4 miles away from Mers-el-Kébir. It's a much larger city. Both cities are both ports are on the coastline of Algeria, and the names tend to be used interchangeably. And in writing this story, it got to be a little bit maddening at times, because even French and British officers, when they're referring to events that occurred at Mers-el-Kébir, use the name Oran. So in the book, I use whatever appears in the actual source material, but you're going to see references through here to both Oran and Mers-el-Kébir. Just understand that the action all occurred in the harbor of Mers-el-Kébir. I talked about my infatuation, and it was bugging me that I needed to learn more, and finally reached the point that this was a book I really wanted to write. And my first serious research visit was to the Churchill archives at the University of Cambridge. And this is the reading room at the Churchill archives. That's my laptop. That's my notepad. That's the first folder of serious material that I was allowed to review. One of the interesting things about working on a project like this is that every archive has its own unique set of rules or quirks. At Cambridge, you're allowed to bring, obviously, laptops and cameras into the room. You can bring in pencils, but you cannot bring in pens. They want to make sure you don't damage the material. If you bring in any paper, the paper has to be yellow to make sure that you don't accidentally insert one of their white letters on white paper into your notepad. So it doesn't show up in the picture here, but that's a yellow notepad. So this is the first folder that I had access to. And there's a story behind this folder. It's a series of papers from Admiral James Somerville. And he was in charge of the British squadron that ended up clashing with the French at Mers-el-Kébir. And in the lower right corner of the folder, you can see that it's closed and was not supposed to be issued. And one of the miraculous things about the Churchill archives is anyone can go there. They encourage appointments, but you don't even need an appointment. But to make your visit productive and efficient, they suggest requesting your materials in advance. So I sent them a list of materials that I wanted to see and got an email back almost right away that you can see everything except for this one folder that had private information. It was private letters to the Somerville family, was his diaries, and said you need permission from the family in order to access this. So they helped me contact Somerville's grandson, Christopher Somerville, who was an author and a journalist in the UK, and he very kindly permitted me access to this material. So I was able to access the holy grail of Somerville information, and very fortunate that Christopher has become an email friend through the years. I was at Cambridge for 3 days, and I ended up taking photographs of just over 800 documents. So you can imagine trying to harness and harvest that much information at one time. So I was very fortunate to be able to take these photographs, bring them back to my home office, the same place I'm speaking from now, and to be able to work through them on my own time, my own schedule. In the lower right corner of this image of images, you can see what looks like a black folder, maybe a black notebook. And it is a black notebook. And what it is, it's one of the diaries of John Colville, who was Churchill's personal private secretary. And Manchester used Colville's diaries. Roy Jenkins used Colville's diaries. Eric Larson, most recently, in his amazing book, The Splendid and the Vile, made large use of Colville's diaries. And to be able to look at and hold the actual handwritten diaries was almost an emotional experience, because he was literally jotting down his experiences, his impressions of the war and of Churchill in real time. And I'm going to zoom in to one page here. And the top half of the screen shows Colville's entry for the day before the British attack on July 2nd, 1940. And Churchill had spent most of that day in the company of General Bernard Montgomery watching a military exercise. And there's a semi-famous story from that where Churchill was invigorated. He invited Montgomery out to dinner and drinks with he and his wife. And when it was time to order drinks, General Montgomery just ordered a glass of water. And Churchill asked him, wouldn't you like something stronger? And Montgomery said, I don't drink and I don't smoke and I'm 100% fit. And Churchill's response was, I drink and I smoke and I'm 200% fit. So one of the joys of researching Winston Churchill is getting to pick up stories like that. And then the second part of this talks about the beginning of the events at Oran. And fortunately, Colville's diaries, there's a printed version of them called The Fringes of Power. And if there's anyone on here who is looking for one book to introduce them to a fascinating side of Winston Churchill, I cannot recommend The Fringes of Power enough. So I tried to spend as much of my research time with primary sources like archives and letters and diaries, but of course, also used a lot of secondary sources. I have 22 pages of endnotes in my book. There's a 12-page bibliography. This was a great book, From the Dardanelles to Oran. And Arthur J. Martyr was an American historian. He's no longer with us, but he primarily focused on the British Navy. And he is sometimes criticized for his use of footnotes. His books are all heavily footnoted. And when I read this book in particular, I noticed that so many of them referenced a letter from French officers, British officers, one German admiral. And I got it in my mind, I have to see those letters. I wanted to see the original letters to see if anything was left out. And this thought popped into my mind during COVID when everything was shut down. So when we were able to travel immediately after the COVID shutdown, my first visit was a flight out to Los Angeles to visit the Martyr archives at the University of California, Irvine. And I was fascinated, of course, by the materials, but I'm also a fan, so I could not resist the impulse to take pictures of some of the incredible signatures, including Churchill's son Randolph, Admiral Somerville's son John, who contributed a lot of information. Admiral Donitz he had a handwritten letter there in German from him. I have no idea what was in that letter, but I couldn't resist photographing his signature. And at the top, Mountbatten of Burma. And there was it had little to do with my book, but there was an incredible chatty exchange of conversation between the two of them. So it helped my book, but it was also a very entertaining experience. One obstacle I had in writing about a clash with the French fleet was I didn't speak French. I had taken 2 years of France when I was in high school and 2 years of French when I was in college, but that was more than 50 years ago. So I knew I had to learn at least how to read French in order to do justice to the story. So I went on, I started this over 10 years ago, and I was not worried about learning to speak French, to write French. I just wanted to learn how to read French. And I started using some online sources like Duolingo, but they were geared more towards how do you find a better table in a restaurant French, or, oh, did you just get a haircut? Or where did you get that hat, Paul, in French? I needed to learn battleship French and scorned ally French. So as part of that, I was traveling a lot. So I put together a series of flashcards for myself with French words and the phrases I needed to learn. I felt like an absolute goof sitting in an airline terminal going through this, but it worked. I was able to read French passively enough to be able to harness. These are some of the resources that I used, and it helped my book enormously to have French stories, the French side of the conflict, of what went into the conflict and the aftermath. So I'm proud of my book. Would not be nearly as proud if I did not have these contributions from French sources.
Just a quick question for you, Bill. We had that comment in advance from James Lapham, who can't be watching the show, about in your research of the secondary sources, were there a couple of particular voices? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of books where there's some on screen there, but was there a particular voice that kind of gave the French perspective and a particular voice that gave the British perspective that were, in a sense, poles apart that shaped your research?
Yeah, there's actually one writer who gave both very well. General Sir Edward Lewis Spears.
Right.
He wrote a 2-volume history of the First World War and 2 volumes on the Second World War called Assignment to Catastrophe. And initially, he was very fluent in French. Initially, he was assigned as Churchill's liaison to Paul Reynaud, the Premier of France. And then after France signed the armistice, he was the liaison to Charles de Gaulle. Of the French sources I found, Pierre Barillon, who was a journalist in the 1940s, he gave very vivid accounts of the lead up and of the battle. Another thing that was important to me was that all of the resources I used, that they be reliable. I had a book from one French seaman who was at Mers-el-Kébir, and his stories they seemed too incredible. He talked about one sailor with a bloody arm because he had a tattoo of a Union Jack and he cut it out when the British started fighting. And that and other things just didn't seem credible. So it's fun to talk about now, but I didn't leave that in my book. And then on the British side, again, Spears gave a good account. He was relatively unbiased, but also John Colville was an amazing resource.
Okay.
So I'd say they would be the two.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. Appreciate the questions. I also wanted to become a better writer. In all humility, I knew I was a decent writer to begin with, but the best way to become a better writer is to read great writers and also do a lot of writing. So I have a newsletter I would write every month about different angles on Churchill. Personally, my favorite historian is Rick Atkinson, and he recently finished the 2nd volume in his trilogy about the American Revolution. So out of respect for you, Paul, and the audience, we won't talk about that book or about that war. But he also read a brilliant trilogy on World War II. And I had read about his research technique, his outlining technique, and he gave a talk after The Guns of Last Light, the 3rd book in his trilogy, came out at a bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I lived 3 hours from there. I rode the train down there. And I wanted to ask him a question about his research technique. So I got in line for the question, and the people before me, asked questions about tactics and strategy in various campaigns. And I stood there and I said, I have a question for you about your research and your organizing technique. And that picture of the author is literally when he laughed at me. And he said, oh, sure, there are about 400 people in the room. And he said, oh, sure, these people want to hear about my researching technique. But then he gave me a 5-minute answer that was just incredibly helpful. And you can see he talks about the heart of your question. How do you distinguish between this that you use and this that you don't use? And what really registered is I'm always looking for fine brushstrokes that bring something or someone to life. And he talked about a fact is not a truth until you love it. And for somebody like me, narrative writers were looking for facts that tease coherence and intimacy from the past. So a lot of what I tried to do with my research in both primary and secondary sources was to find those fine brushstrokes to add unique color to the story. I found in doing this that I love to write, and I reached a point where I was bogged down in research and wasn't doing much writing. So about 3.5 years ago, I wrote and self-published, kind of like I'm doing my second book first. I wrote about how I learned to research and write about Winston Churchill and an event in World War II. And talks about my archive experiences, my Rick Atkinson experience. What it did was it made me a better writer and a much more confident writer. And I don't want to brag, Paul, but a couple of days ago on Amazon, it was ranked number 4,299,680. So I told you I was humble. So with that behind me, that and all the research, that led to the story we're finally going to talk about Operation Catapult, which was the British campaign against the French ships, not just at Mers-el-Kébir, but in other ports. But the primary attack was at Mers-el-Kébir. It was literally published in North America today I'm embarrassed that I did not realize it would not be published in Europe until April 30. I did not realize that until 2 days ago. So I had a couple of questions from some of my friends in the UK about that. One last thing in this prelim, about a month ago, I learned about a new 2-part movie about Charles de Gaulle coming out this summer. And there's a clip of it available online. It's just under 2 minutes. And 5 seconds of that clip shows the British attack at Mers-el-Kébir. And the imagery comes frighteningly close to matching the illustration on the cover of my book. And I don't think I normally yell at my computer, but I'm sure I said out loud, "Oh my God," the first time I watched that. And I've only watched it about 1,000 times since then. But the clip I saw has subtitles, but subtitles or not, I can't wait for that movie to come out this summer. So in the book and in this presentation, there are 5 small sections: Union, Sundered, Adversaries, Mortal Enemies, and an epilogue. The Union, one of the British attack on the French fleet is surprising in a number of ways. And one of the reasons it's so surprising is that the navies were remarkably close on into June of 1940. And it started a couple of years before the war. And a lot of that is due to the gentleman you see here, Captain Cedric Holland, who was the British naval attaché. He was headquartered in France. Before the war, he was also the attaché to the navies of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal, as well as France. But when the fighting started, he focused solely on France. He was very fluent in French. Most French seamen at the French Admiralty considered him a friend as well as a colleague. In the spring of 1940, he left that post and became the commander of one of Britain's 7 aircraft carriers, the Ark Royal. And before he left, Admiral Francois Darlan, who was the admiral of the fleet, the head of the French Navy, he awarded Holland the commander of the Legion of Honor, which is an award that's typically given to admirals. So Holland was a key element in the relations key factor in the relations between the 2 navies. And we'll talk about him a lot more as we get into this. Also, in terms of the cooperation, there was more than just verbal cooperation. French officers were installed in at least four key British ports, moving down the map: Dover, Plymouth, Gibraltar, and Malta. British officers were installed in 4 significant British ports: Dunkirk, Brest, Toulon, and Bizerte. And eventually at Mers-el-Kébir, that's that flag that's outlined in green at the bottom. A British commander, George Kempthorne Collett, was quartered on the French admiral's flagship in that port up until 8 days before the attack. And the navies had sailed in joint exercises together, so it was really that added to the surprise that Britain turned on their recent ally. Winston Churchill, of course, plays a key role in all of this. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty once before and a bit during World War I, from October of 1911 through May of 1915. And then he was asked by Neville Chamberlain to reassume that role literally on the day that war was declared, on September 3, 1939, up until the day he became Prime Minister. And he was an important factor in the cooperation between the 2 navies. He became very close to Admiral Darlan. Churchill wrote that Darlan considered himself the French Navy, and the Navy acclaimed him their chief and their reviver. And he offered a sincere compliment that under Darlan, a magnificent fighting and seafaring force has been developed. And not only have we been assisted in every way agreed upon before the war, but besides, a whole set of burdens have been lifted off our shoulders by the loyal and very increasingly vigorous cooperation of the French fleet. And what's that alluding to, too, is almost all the fighting was done on the fields in France. And the French army played a much more significant role than the British army. But it was understood between the 2 nations that the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force would overly contribute for Britain. And it was also very interesting that the pride of the French Navy, the Dunkirk, and the absolute pride of the British Navy, HMS Hood, sailed together in joint operations against the German Navy in 1939 and 1940, with reciprocal signal teams on board each ship. They sailed freely into each other's harbor. So it was remarkable cooperation. And then there was this remarkable joint operation late in 1939. British warships were carrying Canadian soldiers back to England. And it was a mixed fleet, a joint cooperative effort. And the lead ship was the Dunkirk, and it was sailing under Admiral Marcel Bruno Jansul. And because he was the senior officer, he led the squadron. It was one of the few times in history where British ships sailed under a French admiral. And Cedric Holland was actually elevated to the acting rank of vice admiral for the duration. And Jansul was very complimentary at the end of that operation. He said, "I hope we may have an opportunity of meeting again. I congratulate you on the way you handled the convoy." And Holland reciprocated, "I look forward happily to serving under you again." And then Jansul wrote a report to his boss, Admiral Darlan, referring to Holland as an infinitely courteous, loyal, and able collaborator. As the war moved on, from September of 39 to May of 1940, a lot of people refer to that period as the phony war. There was not a lot going on ground, although there was fighting at sea. There was a meeting of the Senior War Council, and they reached this understanding that seems obvious, common sense. Both governments mutually undertake that during the present war, they will neither negotiate nor conclude an armistice or treaty of peace except by mutual agreement. Of course, they had joint interest. Churchill later termed this pact later acquired high importance, and we'll see why in just a little bit. Churchill, of course, had been a very outspoken opponent of Hitler. During the 1930s, he was one of those rare voices that spoke out against the threat from Germany, about Britain not taking their armament seriously enough. And at the end of March 1940, while he was still First Lord of the Admiral, he warned that the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, were liable to be, quote unquote, subjected to an avalanche of steel and fire. He saw it coming. And about 5 years later, that avalanche occurred on May 10, 1940, when those 3 countries were overrun, and the next day, the German forces rolled into France. Churchill's counterpart in France was Premier Paul Reynaud. And one historian remarked that this was one of the few times in history where the Premier of France was an Anglophile and the Prime Minister of Britain was a Francophile. And they both had great respect for each other and their countries. Someone once referred to Reynaud as a French Winston, and they were very much aligned in their outlook. But Reynaud had a degree of defeatism that Churchill never suffered. And 5 days into the war, he called Churchill, woke him up, said, "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." And obviously they had not lost the battle at that point, but they were under great duress already. Churchill flew to France the next day to buttress the spirit and the attitude and the will to fight of Reynaud and his generals. About 4 weeks later, though, things turned very much against France with the evacuation of most of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. 1/3 men were evacuated, which is not always mentioned that 1/3 of those included Frenchmen. One quote from Churchill, though, is that wars are not won by evacuation. So he recognized that even though there was great relief in Britain, it was a setback. And also, it's important to note that 40,000 British soldiers were left behind, taken as prisoners of war. Almost every British tank was left behind, and many of the major weapons. So certainly France understandably felt betrayed and abandoned, but Britain was in dire straits as well. Churchill, in fact, Paris was abandoned. It was declared an open city, was not defended. There are horrific images of swastikas hanging from the Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower. Churchill continued to argue for the defense of Paris, and he wanted to do anything to keep France in the war. And you'll recognize Charles de Gaulle. This is that General Edward Louis Spears who I mentioned. I just love this picture. And in his book, Spears related Churchill's argument, like when German tanks enter a town, what can people do? The crews must be fired at if they get out, blow down buildings on top of them. He wanted the French army to continue to battle house by house, street by street, which never occurred. And then one of the blessings of reading General Spears is he is such a vivid, poetic writer. And he talked about the French reactions, the visionary writer. The French perceptibly froze. He talked about how they sat back in their chairs with the tension of a motorist pressing hard on the brakes. They were not at all interested in house-to-house fighting in Paris. Paul Reynaud continued to suffer anguish. He referenced the pledge of the joint contributions of Britain and France on June 13, talked about the fact that France has not lost sight of that solemn pledge, but he wanted to know from Churchill, what was their attitude in view of the present situation, the abandonment by Britain, the duress that the French army is going under, and in his own inimitable way, Churchill said, no, you cannot abandon that pledge. He said, the British have not yet felt the German lash. We must fight. We will fight. And that's why we ask our friends to fight on. She still has her fine navy and her great empire, because the French army had been defeated. Their air force was never much of a factor, but their navy was really never affected at all by the German navy, except slightly before the war in Denmark, which is outside of this talk today. Churchill said the war will continue and we can but end in destruction or victory. That's my answer to your question. 2 days later, Churchill was at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country retreat, and in what was categorized a typical Saturday night dinner fortified by brandy and cigars. John Colville, who's pictured here, before and after dinner spent a lot of time on the phone with his connections in France. And he told Churchill afterwards that he's getting the picture that the French will to fight was really waning. So Churchill responded, tell them that if they let us have their fleet, we shall never forget. But if they surrender without consulting us, we shall never forgive. We shall blacken their name for 1,000 years. And then Colville added, then half afraid that I might take him seriously, he added, don't of course do that just yet. But we're going to get to that point. Reynaud persisted. He literally asked for Britain's permission to at least query Germany for what their armistice terms were. And on the 16th, Churchill sent a telegram very specifically saying, okay, we'll allow you to find out what those terms are, provided, but only provided that the French fleet is sailed forthwith for the British harbors. So it was unconditional. He expected, in return for allowing France to breach their agreement, to give up possession of their fleet. Later that same night, this is kind of a ludicrous offer, but Churchill was so intent, in hindsight ludicrous, so intent in keeping France in the war, he proposed a union of the two countries. Charles de Gaulle called Paul Reynaud shortly before a cabinet meeting. Churchill was at de Gaulle's side, and the British offer was to declare France and Great Britain as one Franco-British union. They would have joint defense, foreign, national, and economic policies, joint citizenship, a single war cabinet. The armed forces would all be under one direction. The two parliaments would be together, and thus we shall conquer. That's how they ended that. Paul Reynaud's response was, I will die defending these policies. And then within half an hour, he took them into a meeting of his cabinet, and they were rejected. Lewis Spears wrote an account of that and said that Reynaud read the proposal without heat or fire, like a lawyer defending a cause he did not believe in, and for which he had been promised an inadequate fee. Marshal Pétain, who was the greatest living hero of World War I, Reynaud brought him back from being ambassador to Spain, expecting him to help inspire France to victory. Petain's response was, to make a union with Great Britain was fusion with the corpse. That same night, Reynaud resigned. Pétain became the new leader of France, and he totally ignored the agreement with Britain not to seek a separate peace or separate armistice. Excuse me. The slides seem to have, oh, there we go. So now the agreement between the two countries was sundered. The Germans offered their peace terms in the forest of Compiègne. That rail car you see in the background has a famous history behind it. It actually played a role. Sorry about that. I think the screen is catching up with my earlier.
I think there's a little bit of a lag on the internet. I think that's possibly what's doing it.
Yeah, I think that's it. Let me go back. I think we're going in the right direction now.
There we go.
Okay. Come on, Whiteside.
There we go.
Sorry about that.
No worries. All good.
At the end of World War I, that had been the rolling office of Marshal Foch of France. And he had the German negotiators come to Compiègne, into that rail car, and more or less demanded that they sign an armistice, which Adolf Hitler considered the greatest disgrace of all time to Germany. So now when he had the power to make France sign an armistice, he had the French negotiators come to that same glade at Compiègne. The rail car had been sitting in a museum. He had the front of the museum dynamited. They rolled the rail car to where it had sat in 1918. And that was where France now signed an armistice with Germany. And it was an armistice agreement with 24 articles. The primary interest of Britain, especially, was the naval clause. And also France had a big interest in this as well. And that clause was written to say that the German government solemnly declares to the French government that that does not intend to use for its own purposes in the war the French fleet. And the French felt that they had assurance that they were going to be able to sustain the independence of their fleet or not be stained by the loss of a single ship. But the British were very skeptical that France was going to be able to, or that Germany will live up to that promise. They'd broken so many promises up to that point. And this table, which was actually provided by Churchill in his history of the war, shows the potential impact of a combination of the French, German, and Italian fleets. Britain would still have the lead in aircraft carriers, but would lose the advantage on all important battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and significantly submarines. So they did not want to lose those ships to Germany, especially the battleships. Britain's greatest hope was in Admiral Darlan, who I'd mentioned before. He was the undisputed leader of the French fleet. Somebody referred to him as an admiralissimo. He was admiral of the fleet. And in a telegram to a British ambassador, they said, French government apparently hopeless. Our only hope is Admiral Darlan. Proposed terms put fleet entirely at German command. Ambassador Campbell must insist to Darlan that the fleet cannot be surrendered to Great Britain or the United States. It must be scuttled. And Darlan was very independent. Before the armistice was signed in June 12, Churchill actually called him aside after a meeting and said, Darlan, you must never let them get the French fleet. And Darlan assured him there was no question of that. It would be contrary to our naval traditions and to our honor. A few weeks later, he remarked to a colleague, if one day an armistice is sought, I shall finish my career by an act of splendid indiscipline. I shall leave with the fleet. One of his aides was actually part of the negotiating team at Compiègne. And before he left for Compiègne, Darlan assured him, courage, my friend, they will not get our ships. I will sink them or perhaps get away with them. I repeat, they will not get them. So he was remarkably defiant, at least in words, up until the time of the armistice. A short time after the armistice was signed, however, he sent a cable to his key admirals telling them that secret precautions for sabotage are to be made in order that any enemy or ex-ally seizing a vessel by force may not be able to make use of it. If Germany interferes, warships are without further orders to be dispatched to the United States or scuttled, etc. In no case obey the orders of a foreign admiralty. I highlighted two sections in red because the French shared this cable with the British Admiralty, but they left out two sections in the shared cable, the two sections that are highlighted in red, which really affected the British understanding of Darlan's intent. And then Darlan changed completely in late June. He mentioned to an aide, England is finished. We have no right to separate the fleet from the country. He expected England either to be overrun or to be cowed into submission by the might of the German Wehrmacht that overtook France. And then in a diary entry, fortunately his diary was published in French, but I was blessed to be able to access that. Either the English would have used our fleet against Germans and the France would have suffered, or they would have disarmed it and left it to rot. And then this was another cable from him. This really provides a good understanding of his perspective. I have the terms of the two armistices in hand, the French and the Italian, which mirrored the French armistice, and the conditions for the fleet were identical. Hitler insisted on that. Neither one is dishonorable. Our Navy and our Air Force can be seen by their exceptional treatment to be paid homage for their conduct and recognition of their valor. We keep all of our ships and all of our aircraft of naval aviation for effective seamen on active service are not limited, etc. So he was defiant about the independence of the French fleet, which, as you will see, will affect their willingness to negotiate with Britain moving forward. Churchill happened to remark several years later, if Darlan had chosen to fight in June 1940, he would have been a de Gaulle raised to the 10th power, probably more so than any other French military officer. He really had the ability to change the course of the war, but he elected instead to collaborate with his former enemy. So Britain and France were now adversaries, and certainly Britain was concerned with the entire French fleet. They took possession of some ships in British-controlled harbors, but these four ships were their primary concern. The Strasbourg and the Dunkirk were the newest and largest seagoing French vessels, and they were both in the harbor at Mers-el-Kébir. The other two ships, the Richelieu and the Jean Bart, were actually newer and larger, but neither was yet seaworthy. And the Richelieu made a daring escape from France to a port in Dakar and was not a major factor in the war. The Jean Bart was actually towed from Saint-Nazaire to Casablanca, and she played a little bit of a role from her berth at the dock during an American attack during Operation Torch. But the primary focus of Churchill and the British became the Strasbourg and the Dunkirk, again the two largest and newest seagoing ships in the fleet. I learned and wrote a lot about Admiral Somerville. He was interesting in so many ways. He was a paragon of fitness. He spent a lot of mornings rowing his personal rowboat around his flagship and whatever port he was stationed around other ships there. When he was based in Gibraltar, he would climb the steps of the Mount of Gibraltar. But then remarkably, 5 weeks before the fighting started, 5 weeks before war was declared in September of 1939, he was termed a medical invalid and was invalided out of the British Navy due to a suspected case of tuberculosis. And it was controversial and debatable, and he actually worked his way back into service by being useful. He became very active in the rollout of naval radar to the Royal Navy. He played a key role in the evacuation at Dunkirk. And in late June, he was appointed to lead Force H, which was the British squadron that attacked the French at Mers-el-Kébir. And the attack was scheduled for July 3rd. His squadron, which consisted of 17 ships, departed Gibraltar mid-afternoon on the 2dd. And midway in his journey, he received a cable, which some people think was actually written by Churchill, not by the Admiralty, charging him that you're charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that a British admiral has ever been faced with. We have complete confidence in you and rely on you to carry it out relentlessly. And that task was to subdue the French ships at Mers-el-Kébir and, if necessary, to destroy them. This is what Mers-el-Kébir looks like today. And towards the top of the picture, you can see a stone or concrete breakwater. And in the upper right corner of that is where the French ships were anchored on July 3, 1940. And this was a contemporary picture of those ships. And these were the four ships there that the British were primarily interested in. The Dunkirk, of course, and the Strasbourg I mentioned, but also the battleships Provence and Bretagne, which were older, but they also posed a significant threat to Great Britain. The admiral at Mers-el-Kébir was Marcel Bruno Jean Soult, who I mentioned earlier, who led that combined fleet. Somerville led the French squadron, but he appointed Captain Holland to negotiate for the British. So these two people were very well acquainted with each other. Holland was very fluent in French. One thing that worked significantly against the British, though, is that Jean Soult was offended that the British had sent a mere captain to negotiate with him. His sense of honor was offended, which became a factor during that day. And these real quickly are the terms that the British offered. Sail with us and continue to fight for victory against the Germans and Italians, or sail with reduced crews under our control to a British port, or sail them with us with reduced crews to some French port in the West Indies, Martinique, for instance, where they can be demilitarized or perhaps entrusted to the US. If you refuse these fair offers, I must with profound regret require you to sink your ships within 6 hours. And lastly, finally, failing the above, I have the orders of His Majesty's government to use whatever force may be necessary to prevent your ships from falling into German or Italian hands. So this is the message that Holland delivered to Jean Soult on behalf of Britain. One thing that's been controversial even to this day is that Jean Soult did a horrible job of communicating with his admiralty. He waited until later of the day, and when he communicated the British terms, he left out the least volatile option, the one that I struck out, option number C, about sailing with reduced crews. It's unlikely that the French leadership or Admiral Darlan would have accepted any of these. It would have meant betraying their government and also turning their back on their recent conqueror, but they probably could have worked towards a compromise if that had been known. I'm going to take you real quickly through how fruitless this day of negotiations was. Holland arrived at 6:30 in the morning. He was assigned to HMS Foxhound for the day. He had been captaining commanding the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Jean Soult pretty much ignored him early in the morning, refused to meet with him, and then shortly before 9 o'clock ordered Holland to sail off. And Holland came up with a bit of a gamesmanship himself. After receiving this order, he and two aides climbed down into a motorboat, the Foxhound's motorboat, started heading towards the port of Mers-el-Kébir. They were anchored just outside. And then the commander sent a signal that, oh, it was too late. He was already on his way to your ship. And then shortly after 9 o'clock, the remaining 16 ships at Fort H, which included several battleships, an aircraft carrier with biplanes flying off and circling over the harbor, to impose the significance of the threat, the meaningfulness of the threat, just outside the harbor. Holland had prepared a very detailed script that he planned to work through in his negotiations with Jean Soult. Jean Soult again refused to meet with him, so Holland was forced to send that with one of Jean Soult's aides who came out to meet him on a motorboat. So the impact of his argument was greatly diminished on paper as opposed to being able to argue it directly. Shortly after 11 o'clock, Jean Soult declared he was ready to defend himself by every means possible. Somerville told Holland at 2 o'clock that he should let Jean Soult know that he was ready to open fire at 3 o'clock if the French did not accept the terms. Finally, 10 minutes before 3, Holland received the signal he'd been waiting for all day. The Jean Soult was now ready to receive delegates for an honorable discussion. Now, this is important to know. This is also a picture, another image of the French ships in July of 1940. Captain Holland's ship was anchored in the Gulf of Oran outside the bay, and he had to take this circular route to the Dunkirk, which is the farthest. You can't see me pointing to it. The blue arrow is pointing to it, but that was the farthest ship inside the breakwater. So that passage took about an hour and 15 minutes. So that priceless lost time in Holland's passage was significant because the opportunity for a compromise was waning. He finally boarded Jean Soult's ship at 4:15. At 4:45, Admiral Somerville received a message from his admiralty: settle the matter quickly, or you may have French reinforcements to deal with. Earlier in the day, once the French had reached Admiral Darlan, he had ordered every French ship to head towards Mers-el-Kébir from Algiers or any other port to reinforce Jean Soult. Spoiler alert, they never got there or didn't get there in time, but the British understood that they were, vulnerable to attack by French ships. Finally, the negotiations, even face-to-face, went nowhere. Somerville let Jean Soult know that if our propositions are not accepted by 5:30, I shall have to sink your ships. Holland finally climbed down for the Dunkirk at 5:25. And shortly after that...
Just a quick question for you, Bill.
Yes.
There was one that came in from James earlier. You're relaying all the details of these official exchanges. You've talked about the correspondence, but Churchill, etc. But was there any kind of independent intelligence coming from anywhere? Are there any kind of British nationals in the area or French people who are working for the Brits who are painting another picture of these events, or was it all coming through official channels?
The unofficial channels were basically the lower level British officers, and I should have mentioned this before, who were personal friends with a lot of the French seamen that they knew. I mean, they had been quartered together on their ships, and basically once you get below the level of Admiral of the Fleet in the British Navy, the British officers, Royal Navy officers, were almost to a man absolutely horrified at the thought of having to fire on their recent allies. And there's more to this than we had time to get into today, but Somerville actually had planned to bluff an attack, to fake an attack. He thought that between he and Holland, he could convince the French to submit to one of the British demands before force was required. And especially with the threat of reinforcements, Somerville decided to forego that. But I'm not aware of any agents or spies that were giving other information. There was another British admiral, Dudley North, who had sailed into Mers-el-Kébir, met with Jean Soult about 10 days before the clash. And I mean, he was convinced that the French would not submit, but the other more British officers were also convinced that under no conditions would the French give up their ships to the Germans, that they would scuttle their ships before Germany had a chance to take a single ship. So there was that internal clash, which added to the drama of the story. I mean, obviously Churchill could make his own decisions, but it was not a black and white decision either for him. There was a lot of angst going into this. Holland's report of his meeting with Admiral Jean Soult ended with, "We were about 1 mile to seaward when fire was opened." The ship at the bottom is HMS Hood, the pride of the British Navy. That was Admiral Somerville's flagship. A flag was hoisted from the Hood at 5:54. That this was a signal for open fire, may be obeyed as soon as seen, and fire commenced within several seconds. The British ships were well offshore, 17,500 yards or 10 miles offshore. The passage of each 2,000-pound shell took 20 seconds. So with not an immediate explosion. I caught one mistake on the last bullet point here. A massive explosion was seen and heard at 5:57. That should be 3 minutes after the fire was open. And it hit the fourth ship at against the breakwater, the Britannia. Hit her in the stern. She was decimated almost immediately. I'll get into the specific numbers in just a minute. Had the most significant loss of life of the French ships there. This was later that evening. She was practically completely below the water. Another gruesome thing is that with the ships going down, the harbor was fouled with floating oil, which really made the challenge of rescuing people difficult. They were so coated with oil, they were slick. Even when rescuers tried to grab them by the hair to pull them out of the water, that was a difficult task. Another ship, a destroyer, the Mogador, was destroyed when a British shell hit the depth charges that were stored on her stern. And a lot of the damages to French ships, I forgot to mention earlier on, the French ships were anchored stern out. So their sterns were facing the Mediterranean, their bows and their big guns. There'll be, I think, another picture coming up. You'll be able to see they were facing the shoreline. So they were at a disadvantage. One unfortunate irony, I mentioned early on that the Hood and the Dunkirk had sailed together. And the Hood had received orders to target the northernmost vessel in the line of warships, which turned out to be the Dunkirk. So she was firing, and her men on board were horrified at firing on the men that they had sailed with. So here's another image. You can kind of make out how the French ships are facing the shoreline rather than their potential adversaries. There's a great British naval historian, David Brown, who mentioned in his book about this affair that the worst possible outcome would have been an escape of one of the French ships, and the worst happened. One of the key ships in terms of British interest was the Strasbourg, and she was able to make an escape even though the entrance to the harbor had been mined. So she made her way out of the harbor at the same time that Somerville had ordered his ships further off to the west to avoid French shelling. So Strasbourg was able to gain 30 miles on the British and was never caught and made her way back to Toulon. The Dunkirk was badly wounded but was not sunk. She was beached across the harbor from Mers-el-Kébir, but the British were not sure just how much damage she had and weren't sure if they had to go back to confront her again. A French admiral trying to be helpful reported that the damage to the Dunkirk is minimal. This ship will soon be repaired. So the British determined to further her disrepair. They attacked her again on July 6th with torpedo bombers flying off from the Ark Royal. This did not work according to plan. The Dunkirk was surrounded by patrol boats that had recently been on anti-submarine duty. The first British torpedo actually hit one of those patrol boats, did not explode, but speared a hole in that patrol boat. It sunk in shallow water next to the Dunkirk. The next wave of British torpedoes hit that sunken boat and set off her torpedoes. So the 14th depth charges exploded, and that kept the Dunkirk out of the war for the remainder of the year. The reaction was mixed around the world. Galeazzo Ciano was Benito Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, and he has a very unfiltered diary in which he mentioned, for the moment, it proves that the fighting spirit of His British Majesty's fleet is quite alive and still has the aggressive ruthlessness of the captains and pirates of the 17th century. James Somerville was anguished in the aftermath. He wrote to his wife, said, "I should not be surprised if I was relieved forthwith. I don't mind it because it was an absolutely bloody business to shoot up those Frenchmen. The truth is my heart isn't in it. You're not allowed to have a heart in wartime." And then he later wrote, "I hate the idea of being regarded as the unskilled butcher of Oran." His anguish was furthered a week later when he received this from the surviving officers on the Dunkirk. The commander and officers informed me of the deaths, etc. I'll let you read the rest of this. But they expressed their bitter sadness. They exchanged some mementos, and this, at a very personal level, really wounded Admiral Somerville. One of the most surprising reactions was from Charles de Gaulle. He found out about the attack as it was happening, or just before it happened, and he thought that Jean Soult would submit to the British demands. But then in the aftermath, he was given access to BBC microphones. And he started by saying there was not a Frenchman who has not heard with pain and anger that ships of the French fleet have been sunk by our allies. This grief and anger come from innermost depths of our being. I ask the British to spare us, as well as themselves, any portrayal of this hateful tragedy as a direct naval success. To consider it such would be both unjust and out of place. But then, remarkably, there cannot be the slightest doubt that on principle and of necessity, the enemy would have used them against Britain or against our own empire. I therefore have no hesitation in saying they are better off destroyed. This is Admiral Jean Soult, 4 days after the initial British attack, just before the French victims were buried. Over slightly under 1,300 French seamen were killed, 1,257. More than 1,000 of them alone were on the Britannia, that first ship that was blown up. And to, Paul, you've probably heard this, that to many in France, this is considered the equivalent of Pearl Harbor.
We had a question just to clarify the document. Trevor Sheehan wants to know, where is the document, the Dunkirk to Somerville note? Which archive is that in?
In the Churchill archive. And also, I have a copied version of that I took a photograph of that. And then earlier this year, Christopher Somerville actually sent me this version of it, which I think was in his grandfather's personal papers, because this is the first time I've seen it with different color signatures, with blue signatures. But I first saw this at Cambridge in the Churchill archives. So
Thank you.
I felt it was a remarkable document. Thank you. President Roosevelt expressed his approval. He said even the French ambassador, the Vichy ambassador at that point, came to hoping to get Roosevelt on his side. And Roosevelt's response was, even if there was only an extremely remote possibility that your fleet would pass into German hands, the British government had good reason to act as it did. I would not have acted otherwise. I am a realist. One of the reasons the British took this action is they pretty much to a man trusted the character of even Admiral Darlan and other admirals and French seamen, but they did not believe they would have the opportunity to sink their own ships, to scuttle their ships before Germany took them over. And then 2 years later, November of 1942, most of the surviving French fleet was in the harbor at Toulon, the French naval base there. And early in the morning, Germany attacked, wanted to take over those ships. And the order to sabotage and scuttle the fleet went out along the harbor. The Strasbourg was the first ship to be scuttled. She sank at her berth. The Dunkirk was sitting in a dry dock. She was hauled out and decimated. Weapons, communications equipment, navigational tools were all mangled. 3/4 of the remaining ships were sunk at Toulon. It was a shallow harbor, and the Italian fleet actually refloated several of them, but did not make very good use of them. But most of the remaining French ships, which were in North Africa, actually joined the Allies for the remainder of the war. Churchill's reaction, no surprise, he believed it was a success. He said no act was more necessary for the life of Britain. 6 months after the event, FDR sent his aide, Harry Hopkins, to assess Winston Churchill personally and also the will of Britain to continue. And John Colville mentioned in his diary that Churchill remarked that he believed that Oran had been the turning point in our fortunes. It made the world realize that we were in earnest in our intentions to carry it on. And I think that was the most significant effect of what happened. It was not a great naval victory. It was not a great military victory. It turned the majority of France against Britain, but it convinced the British that the right man was now leading their country at a time of battle. It convinced Roosevelt that the British had the will to continue. It convinced Hitler that Winston Churchill was unlike any other leader he had confronted to this point. So that was, the most significant contribution here. And I just want to add one final thing before we end here. You write a book. Hopefully you get a publisher. I was fortunate that the Naval Institute Press agreed to publish my book. And then you go about getting permissions to include quoted material and to find photographs for your book. And I found some great photographs of the harbor at Mers-el-Kébir on a French website. So I somewhat naively left a message on the site asking for their permission to include in a book that this unknown American writer was about to put out about the British attack on their harbor. And they wrote back very quickly, "Do not forget Oran" is still an important slogan within France. And the response read, "Well, we have a duty to avoid any collaboration in works which would be too partisan and would lack the necessary objectivity to deal with a tragedy which finds its true foundations both in the historical context of the time and in the political context of Great Britain, and particularly in that of Sir Winston Churchill at this period. I also learned that the gentleman who responded, his grandfather had been killed by the British at Mers-el-Kébir."
Wow.
That was my reaction.
Yeah.
That started a correspondence. And I shared some passages from my book that I took pains to learn the French side, that I wanted to contribute a fair and to a balanced account. And I certainly give my opinion of whether it was right or not, but I want readers to be able to decide from their own. And he eventually accepted that he was comfortable with me using the picture, which unfortunately we couldn't use because it was not the right resolution for a finished book. But that led to a further exchange of messages. He allowed me to interview him for my newsletter. And I was most interested in his impression of Winston Churchill. He talked about his grandfather, he talked about Admiral Darlan, but I asked him this question about Churchill, and I'll leave this up here for just a minute. I'll let people read this on their own. But he took he had a very nuanced, objective impression of Churchill. And his group at the time was in the last stages of erecting a permanent memorial to the victims of Mers-el-Kébir at Brest. It was unveiled in July of last year. In different slides, I put up different numbers for the number of victims. And the accounts vary from just under 1,200 to the most popular is 1,297. This group, however, did a certified accounting of the victims because there was, they came from different lists. Some of the names were wrong, and they've settled on the fact that there were 1,257 victims, where when you write a book, especially, you want to get this right. So I'm going with their numbers. And one of the most remarkable things I found was on this French website, there's a link to the website for the HMS Hood Association. And the Hood Association has a link to their website. They visit each other's memorials. They take place in honoring each other. So, this is a remarkable reflection on the character of both sides. And the last thing, I showed this slide earlier. This is Mers-el-Kébir today. And the Association of Former Sailors of Mers-el-Kébir put this on social media late last year. And I think their inscription is wonderful. Let it be a symbol for you of the gentleness and calmness that these images of the port of Mers-el-Kébir inspire, where the souls of our sailors float forever. And we talk about war. There's a lot of that today. We talk about body counts and, the horror of war. But I think this really encapsulates the personal effect of this. And these are fathers and sons and daughters. So I think this is a great message to end with. So, Paul, thank you for having me on. Thank you for the questions you've asked to this point. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Well, brilliant stuff. And there are some questions. Predictably, there's some questions. We can't do all of them. Sure. Trevor asked very early on, have you ever visited Mers-el-Kébir yourself?
I did not. And when I started this project, I was sure I was going to have to visit there. And at the time, the U.S. State Department suggested that American citizens were in significant danger if they visited Algeria. So I chickened out. I didn't go. I don't think, in some respects, I wish I had gone. I believe in, visiting. I went to Compiègne. That was an important place for me to visit. In perfect circumstances, I think anyone who writes a story should visit the places that they write about. But that's a trip I did not take. And I'm not aware of any information in Algerian archives.
Yeah, living in France, I get sort of notifications. Morocco is always okay to visit, but Algeria kind of goes on and off various lists of, you can go there, sort of go there, don't go there. It's complicated. We got some more. Thank you for answering that one. Darlan and Gensoul's sort of fallout. We had a question from Marks and Sparks. Post-attack, did Darlan ever discover that Gensoul's petulance got 1,200 sailors killed, a battleship sunk, and others damaged? And if he did, why was there no kind of court-martial? I mean, is there's the kind of British angle of coming at this, there's the French angle, but in response to that question.
Sure, he was not court-martialed, but he was ushered out of the French Navy. He was, the attack happened on July 3rd. The funeral service occurred on July 7th. Gensoul left that night, flew back to France, raised his flag on the Strasbourg in the harbor at Toulon. Darlan visited on July 19th, met with Gensoul, but refused to discuss Mers-el-Kébir.
Right.
And about 2 months later, Gensoul was forced to retire from the French Navy and was given this unofficial title, this mocking title of First Social Worker of the Sea. And one other quick thing, that British historian, or the American historian of the British Navy, Arthur Martyr, wrote a letter to Gensoul 30 years later. Gensoul was 92 years old, asking him if he would have done anything differently that day. And there's a handwritten letter in Martyr's archives from Gensoul saying no. He once again tried to justify his actions based on what he knew at the time. And he was in very difficult circumstances. I mean, he was obstinate. He was less inclined than a lot of other admirals to disobey his orders, but he refused to budge. But if he had budged, he would have betrayed Darlan. He would have betrayed the armistice agreement. So I respect the situation he was in.
Thank you. What did the Third Reich, what did Hitler think about it? I mean, did he speak about it in any notable way?
I don't believe he spoke about it directly. I never found that. But at the time, Hitler and his generals were working on Operation Sea Lion, the plans for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned cross-channel invasion of Britain, which was expected to take place probably in the fall. The plan was to weaken the Royal Air Force first in the Battle of Britain, and we know how that worked out. The Luftwaffe did not gain the upper hand, and Operation Sea Lion, which again would have been an invasion by boats and ships across the channel, largely from France, never occurred. And there's a school of thought was that the British action and what Hitler learned about Churchill's resolve and character convinced him that that was not a risk worth taking at that time.
Thank you. Lots of comments about the effect on the British public, reinforcing Churchill's statement. A representative one from Ian Carr is he heard that there was a propaganda aspect to this action in that it reinforces to FDR the British attitude. And I think, we think of Churchill as being, making those speeches committing the British and the Commonwealth and the world to the war effort, but it definitely shows that he's someone not to be messed with. I mean, whether or not it was the right decision, there's a certain sense of he does what he wants to do. Do you see that in it as well?
Oh, sure. And my book had probably a half dozen working titles. And one was a quote, it would have been a horrible title, but it was a quote from Churchill where he talked about the impact of propaganda, the value of words, and few people were as good as him. But he ended by saying it's events that move the world. And he understood that it was actions that are more important than words. And in terms of propaganda, Churchill certainly was courting Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted his approval. Obviously, he wanted him in the war. Roosevelt did not need a lot of convincing. He respected Churchill, but this solidified his belief that Churchill had the will to hold out. More significantly, I found a little story in the New York Times from that time. Roosevelt was limited in the aid that he could offer because he was limited by the United States Congress, which wanted no part in another war on foreign shores that America had no direct hand in. And one of the leaders of that was the head of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, a senator named Key Pittman. And the week before Mers-el-Kébir, he made a statement that Winston Churchill and the French Navy should abandon the British Isles. He said they just do not have the resources to confront Germany, to defend themselves against Germany. The day after the action at Mers-el-Kébir, he turned 180 degrees. He said, this convinced me that this is what I was looking for. This convinced me that Churchill has it in him. He's the leader that Britain needs. So in terms of propaganda value, there's more value in terms of propaganda than in terms of military. I mean, the Allies would have won the war if Britain never attacked those ships at Mers-el-Kébir. Yeah. But it convinced people that, for roughly 17 months until Pearl Harbor was invaded and the U.S. got into the war, that Britain at least had the will to hold out.
Yeah. It kind of comes into that category of things almost like the Doolittle raid and the early British commando raids. It's about the message it's sending to the wider world more than it is necessarily about the actual result of the action on the ground or on the sea. Trevor is also asking, and how did British newspapers support or report it at the time? Because, there's been this 1,000 years of rivalry between the British and the French, and the British press is always quick to sort of jump on a frogs joke, just like the French are keen to jump on a roast beef joke. So how was it, we've talked about the historiography and the writing after the war, but at the time, how did the press handle it?
I wish I could remember the specific quotes. There are several of them towards the end of my book, but they were, to me, as an American, surprisingly nuanced. They did not treat it as a great victory. They supported Churchill's actions, but there was genuine sorrow for France and the fact that they had to defend a decision by their leader, that the French Navy had to defend a decision by their leaders, and that, there was, it was not a great declaration of victory, which surprised me. I thought there'd be more, gung-ho celebration, but I found very little of that.
Jamie asked, was there any information or talk about any retribution? Supposing the French fleet had got out and they'd gone to the UK or Canada or somewhere else, were there any inklings about the fact that there might have been punishments? I know Vichy is establishing this now for now, but is there anything you discovered about a potential reaction by the Germans against the French population or other members of the French services or anything like that?
Yeah, there were fears of that, and that was communicated by British naval officers, because they tried to convince the First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Dudley Pound, and others that now that France had signed an armistice, and after some deliberation, the Germans approved the stationing of French ships in North African ports, that there was very little risk of the French ships being taken over. And they feared if they allowed Britain to take over those ships, that their families would receive retribution. There is a fear, even at the highest level of Britain, that what's going to happen if Hitler says, I'm going to burn Nice if you do not give me these ships today. I'll burn Marseille tomorrow, and then Paris 3 days later if we don't get these ships. So there was, significant fear of what would happen based on who gained control of the ships. So that certainly affected the decision of anyone in the French Navy to not surrender their ships to Britain. And there was a point, Darlan got to the point where he considered Britain actually more of a rival than Germany, just before the action at Mers-el-Kébir.
Thank you. Well, the last one I think I'm going to address from Caswayne here is, did Mr. Whiteside's research include the counter proposals by Admiral Pound, which was with respect to the French fleet? If so, does he feel Pound's proposals may have diffused the situation to a better end? Because we haven't really talked about counterfactuals. You've given us that granular detail of the actual exchanges, what happened, and the sequence of events. But there were other possibilities. There were alternate actions people could take. So did you kind of go down that path of looking at the alternative things, and particularly with respect to Admiral Pound?
Yes, this is a great, very well-informed question, because a couple of reasons. While this is going on, this was not a subject for today, but there was also severe disagreement in the harbor at Alexandria. And there, a British Admiral Andrew Cunningham and French Admiral René-Emile Godfrey were able to reach compromise, although that risked flaring out of control based on what went on at Mers-el-Kébir. Admiral Dudley Pound, he was initially in favor of offering demilitarization of the French ships, because that's what worked out at Alexandria. And actually, it was Churchill who raised that first in a War Cabinet meeting. And Dudley Pound embraced that immediately. And Churchill and the War Cabinet eventually decided that they would not list that in the demands offered at Mers-el-Kébir. However, he had a caveat that if the French requested demilitarization, the British could accept that. Somerville and Holland were permitted to accept demilitarization if the French requested it, and if they were convinced demilitarization could be accomplished within 6 hours, and the ship would have to be out of the war for at least 1 year. And then one last thing on that, Churchill and the War Cabinet and Admiral Pound were getting updates about the lack of progress during the day on July 3rd. And during a War Cabinet meeting, Dudley Pound raised the prospect of demilitarization, suggesting, looks like it's working in Alexandria. Let's diffuse the situation there. And Churchill refused on the grounds that, well, if we offer it at this point, it will make it look like we're weakening.
Yeah.
So it was not made readily available to the French. And that certainly could have changed the outcome of that day.
Thank you. And there are lots of other questions, but we're not going to do them all because we're not. My last takeaway from this, Bill, has been I've always referred to Operation Torch as maybe the most strained the relationship between the USA and the UK was. And of course, France is part of that as well, and which horsed back from the Allied point of view in terms of the various French figures there. And Michael Nyberg's been on the channel talking about that. But
sure.
we talk about with great interest about these difficulties between the French, the British, the Americans, the British, et cetera, et cetera. I always want to remind myself that generally we get over them. The Allies get over their difficult. They get over their massive, great disagreements over the course of 5 years. And it's luckily for us, luckily for the world, it was the Third Reich, and it was the Axis where the rifts became so serious. People just weren't. There were German generals handing back their medals in 1944 to Hitler with angry letters and things like that, and the Germans kind of self-implode. I think it's a testament to all these people on the French figures, the British figures, American figures, that they are able to mostly understand that wars are very complicated and there will be moments where agreements and things don't align, but at the end there will be this common belief in defeating the Third Reich and getting peace back to Europe. So I think these discussions about all this are fascinating, but in the end it did kind of sort itself out. And the fact that there's this relationship you mentioned between HMS Hood and the victims of this today, I think is testament to this overarching ability for our friendly neighbors to put things behind us.
Let's hope so. You're right.
Yeah.
The leaders were passionate type AAA personalities, but they were also pragmatic, rational men, and they realized what was really important for the future of the people they led. Yeah.
No, thank you. So, Bill, fantastic talking to you. So, folks, as you said, if you're over the USA, you can order the book right now. Well, you can get the book right now. If you're in the UK or Europe, you have to order it, pre-order it, and wait for it to come. Links to purchasing it are in the description below. There's the actual publisher's page, and then there's the bookstore page, or you can get it wherever you get your books. And as always, when Churchill comes up, we said at the beginning, there's still lots to talk about when it comes to Churchill and all the people and the actions that sort of surround him in this. That JD from History Underground put on Facebook a couple of days ago. There was a survey of the 100 most influential figures in world history forever, and everyone's in it from Abraham Lincoln to Jesus Christ, and of course, somewhere in the top 10 is Churchill. And how can you possibly understand the 20th century without Churchill being part of it? He's central to everything.
Obviously biased, but could not agree more. Yes.
Yeah. So, folks, go and get the book. Folks, we're back with Bud Bowie. He's back tomorrow talking about strategic bombing. You remember him talking about artillery. He's talking about various things. That's the Colonel's fantastic analysis of how the USA developed its strategic bombing program. Then Frank Blazich is on me on Thursday talking about 19 heroes of the US Navy Seabees. And Friday, Arthur Glaxton is coming back for part 2 of his defeat of the 12th SS in Normandy. Looking forward to all of those. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, read their blogs, etc., so they give us more history. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, viewers. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we got to a lot of them and the key ones. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, Paul.